Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade. Yes, we're rocking on number 50. Symphony number 50, which means we're sort of almost kind of halfway there. Well, maybe in 2 or 3 more we'll be exactly halfway there, but 50 is such a resonant number, and it's a symphony that everybody ignores, really to their detriment. Symphony number 50 is in C major. It's one of those Haydn special C major symphonies with high horns and trumpets and drums. You can leave out the trumpets because they double the horns or use trumpets instead of horns, but it's always best if you have both. Of course, naturally, the more the merrier when it comes to Haydn, for sure. Otherwise, the orchestra is very normal. It's just a couple of oboes and strings and maybe a bassoon, something like that. Thank God, usually not a continuo at this point anymore. Yay, we don't have to deal with the harpsichord as often as not. In this particular performance that we're going to hear on Naxos, which is absolutely fabulous. It's with the Swedish Chamber Orchestra, I think, under Bela Drahos. Yeah, the Swedish Chamber Orchestra. Yeah, it's really, really good. It's marvelous. But number 50, it comes after 49. Yeah, I know, 50 comes after 49. What I mean is in the numbering. The order of composition, well, we don't know a lot of those things, but number 49 is such a big deal symphony. It's La Passione. It's a big minor key, Haydn's last church sonata symphony. It's a big deal. And because it's a big deal, 50 is a little deal. Nobody cares. It doesn't seem to have the same emotional, depth as number 49. Well, I think that's probably true. It's probably a fair statement. Number 50 is not about plumbing depths of emotion. It's about form. Oh, I know, it's about form. And so if you're a form whore like me, you're going to love number 50. I love number 50. It's so clever. And it does present a kind of a detective case that we're going to explore a little bit, because the formal question is, you would think it's technical, but it's not. It's about the shape and balance of the movements and how they all relate to each other. And for me, that's the essence of what, talking about symphonies is. I mean, symphonies are not just big emotional things. They're things that relate to each other in certain special ways. And this symphony has some of the most special relationships of any Haydn symphony. I am not kidding. In particular, the mystery, the detective work we need to do involves this question. Where did the first 2 movements come from? And this is a very, very interesting issue, because these first 2 movements do something that virtually nothing in a Haydn symphony ever happened before. They leave out the second half repeats, the big second half repeats. Now, I need to explain that a little bit so that we know where we are. A typical movement in sonata form, which is what most movements in symphonies are in one way or another, has 3 sections articulated in 2 big parts. Those sections we've talked about many times. It's the exposition, which presents the themes, the development, which doodles the themes, and the recapitulation, which repeats the themes all in the home key. That's the tripartite understanding of sonata form. But sonata form is first and foremost binary. Those sections get repeated. Section 1, the exposition, gets repeated, and sections 2 and 3, the development and recapitulation, are the second big section, the second part of the movement, and that usually gets repeated. Most of the time we don't know this, because until the period instrument people came along and whatnot, nobody paid any attention to second half repeats. They just weren't done. We left them out because they're optional. Repeats are always optional for the most part, unless the composer writes them out or he says something about it, or there's some unbelievably obvious formal reason why you need to do them. You usually have choice. So these 2 movements, both the first movement and the slow movement, the andante, do not have second half repeats. That has led some to speculate that they began life as theater music, overtures to an opera or theatrical presentation or something. And that makes a lot of sense, because if you look at Beethoven's theatrical music, Egmont, Coriolanus, or Coriolan in that case, Coriolan or other, Leonora numbers 1, 2, 3, whatever you want, or Mozart, the Marriage of Figaro, and Così fan tutti, and all these opera overtures, they don't have repeats. That's because they're overtures. Essentially because they're introducing something much bigger and much longer, and you don't want to make a meal of the overture by itself. So they lack those bits. Now, these two movements have first half repeats, which Haydn very easily could have added, or he just left them in, but they don't have second half repeats. So that leads to the theory that maybe they had a theatrical origin. But that's not what makes it so interesting, this symphony. What makes this symphony so interesting, and what really sends chills up my spine, I'm not kidding, is that because these have no repeats, Haydn could very easily have just said, repeat them, right? You just write like 2 dots at the end of the part, and everyone goes back and they repeat it from the middle section or wherever it started. No problem. But he didn't do that. He didn't do it at all. He said to himself, and this is why geniuses are just so great to look at. Oh my God. He said, hey, I've got 2 movements. They're unusually short. So why don't I make a symphony about restoring the normal symphonic balance? That's what this symphony's about. It's about how we arrive at basic, clear symphonic form. But we only get there in the finale. So what that means is that this whole symphony is a finale symphony, which is very, 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 very rare in the classical period. The first movement is usually the most complex, the biggest. The second movement is relaxed. The minuet's a dance-like thing, and the finale is zippy and pleasant and fast and ebullient, and it just wraps things up, in a lighthearted way. That's the usual progression. But this symphony doesn't do that. This symphony does it backwards. It gets longer as it goes. The minuet and the finale are both longer than the first movement and the andante. And that is an extraordinary thing. A really extraordinary thing. But Haydn doesn't do it that way because he has no choice. He does it deliberately. He does it to say, hey, I can write a really original and different kind of symphony by altering the balance of shape of the individual movements while still writing a symphony, while relating them to each other and doing all the Haydn-y things that Haydn always does in all of his symphonies. So how does he achieve this? And he wants us to understand that. He wants us to know that there's something a little bit awry with the first movement, and that slow movement is a little bit cool and kind of tossed off. But then the minuet starts to get kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. And the finale is dazzling and fabulous and in very strict form. And so he's making a point. And how does he make that point? Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Now that we have that lengthy introduction, we are ready to hear the actual music. We're going to have some very extensive examples because the only way you get the sense of the proportions is to hear large chunks of the later movements in any case. So the movement begins with a trompe l'oreille, or whatever, a fool the ear thing, as they would say in French, trompe l'oeil, fool the eye paintings, with weird perspective things, or M.C. Escher. Well, this is an M.C. Escher type first movement. It should not exist. It's impossible in its proportions. It's fabulous. It begins with a very majestic, rather pompous and self-important introduction. A big introduction to something really, really significant and serious. Here is the introduction. Let's just listen to it. Again, this is the Swedish Chamber Orchestra under Bela Drahos. See what I mean? That is, pomp and circumstance. That's something important's going on. Nothing important is going on. What happens then is one of the absolute shortest first movements Haydn ever wrote. I mean, it's 4 minutes and a bit with the introduction. Take out the introduction and you've got 3 minutes of music, maybe. The exposition is less than a minute long. That's shorter than a lot of Haydn's earliest symphonies. It's really, really compact. It has a zippy first subject, a very clear, teeny, teeny, tiny second subject. It just goes do 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 do. That's it. And then it repeats the exposition. I'm going to play you the exposition just so you get a sense of it, because it's less than a minute long. Now, the opening theme, you'll also notice, is really off kilter. It's syncopated, it has a very odd rhythm. It's all a little bit, push me, pull you. It's a little bit off kilter. And here is the exposition. It's light, it's playful, it's not heavy or serious, especially after that big introduction. So after you've heard this really short introduction, and then the rest of the movement has a tiny little development section and then a recapitulation, and then it just stops, it just ends. It's somehow unsatisfying. I mean, not in a frustrating way, but in a we need to hear what happens next. This cannot be the whole story. That kind of unsatisfying. It's incomplete in what it's trying to tell us, because that big introduction promised something that the main body of the allegro, the quick stuff, just doesn't deliver. Now, we don't have to hear the slow movement because it does something similar, only in a slow tempo. It has a repeat, and there is no repeat in the second half. It's a brief, charming, rather cool movement that resolves nothing, which is the whole point. It makes you want to hear what's going to happen next. But then comes the minuet, and the minuet is amazing. Amazing. First of all, it's a big, long minuet. It's one of Haydn's sort of stately and it's not a danceable minuet. Most of Haydn's minuets can't be danced because they're too rhythmically tricky, and they have strange phrase lengths, and they do things that would trip up any real dancers. But it has that dance-like quality, that stately movement of the dance that you get from, the aristocratic minuet. But here's the cool thing. Minuets, as you know, since we've discussed a billion of them, come in very, very strict form. They're in the minuet proper, the main body of it is in two halves, both of which are repeated, and that happens here. Then you have what's called a trio, a middle section. And this trio is also in two halves, both repeated, except this one isn't. This is one of the weirdest trios Haydn wrote, because what happens is it begins just like the minuet, and then it realizes, wait a minute, I shouldn't be doing that. It stops on a wrong note, and then the actual trio part starts, and the first half is repeated, and the second half is not. And this is, something Haydn could only have done after thinking about what the first two movements did, because the minuet is trying to reestablish a symmetrical pattern, a symmetrical form, and the trio throws it completely off, discombobulates it completely. And so I'm going to play you the complete minuet. It's over 4 minutes. You have to hear the whole thing. And I will indicate with a little marking where the trio begins, just so you're clear on it. And you can hear the first half gets repeated, then the second half just sort of peters out, and then the minuet repeats itself. Really extraordinary and unusual. And you hear in this minuet the conflict that has been brewing since the beginning of the symphony. And you begin to realize, wait a minute, something's going on here. Oh my goodness. So here is the total minuet. unusual stuff, isn't it? Yeah. That is a very, very unusual minuet, and it's so specific to what is going on in this symphony. It could exist in no other work. It really couldn't, because it makes reference to what's been happening earlier. Now, the finale, as I said, is a beautiful movement in perfect binary form. This is where the symmetry that has been lost since the first movement finally reasserts itself. And it does it in such a fabulously satisfying way. It's the longest movement in the symphony. And it's also monothematic. In other words, it's all based on one tune. A beautiful, wonderful tune that we're going to hear a lot of. But that tune has the same structure as the opening movement, the tune in the opening movement. So the finale is in some ways a correction of what happened in the opening movement, although it's very balanced. It's not syncopated. It's not out of whack. It's nothing where Haydn is being as strong as he possibly can be musically in asserting the rigorous symmetry of this finale. But I want to show you, I'm going to play you the opening theme and the theme of the finale, one right after the other. I made little excerpts with like a 1-second pause between them, so you can hear that the structure of the melody is the same. That is, tune, loud interruption, repeat of tune. I mean, that's all it is. And that's what it is in both cases. And this is the kind of thing you need to start to get an ear for when you listen to Haydn or any of the classical composers, because they can allude to things without literally repeating, without quoting, but because the structure is the same, the form, the call and response form of this movement or of this melody is the same in both cases. So here is the comparison between the first movement, first subject, and the finale's main theme. Did you hear it? It was right, tune, loud bit, tune. That's how they both work. And then taking the same thing, Haydn then constructs a beautifully exciting finale that has two halves, both of which are repeated, and they take the repeat here, because you must take this repeat in order to make the whole point that Haydn's been shooting for. I mean, if you don't do the repeat in this finale, then you miss the point of the whole symphony. Really. And, you know, some conductors get it and some conductors don't. Doesn't mean the music isn't enjoyable, but the wider point, the wider object of the entire work, well, that's another matter altogether. And to really be able to articulate and project the deep structure of the piece. And this is one of those works, like always with Haydn, he's not trying to put one over on you. He's not trying to be crazy, sophisticated, or abstruse. He wants you to get the point. And so here is the entire finale. It goes for like 5 minutes and a bit. I mean, it's an amazing, beautiful finale, all based on one theme, which is, it's just, you'll get it in your head and you'll never forget it. Believe me. So there it is. Now, think about it for a minute. Number 50 is one of the most unusually rare, one of the most neglected of all of the middle period Haydn symphonies. You never hear it performed. But just look at what a fascinating piece of music it is. How individual. And that's what we find over and over again in Haydn, even in the ones people don't pay any attention to. If you listen to them, if you pay attention to it, you're going to hear things you will hear in no other work by anybody, anywhere, any place, any time. That's Haydn's genius. Even these shorter and less familiar pieces do extraordinary things. Absolutely extraordinary. So thank you so much for joining me, friends. Please keep on listening. Take care.